It was difficult going back to a place that everyone was really nice, but everyone had obviously heard about what had happened. So I'm sort of going in, but I know that most people will know about this sensational story I suddenly felt like I was a story. What I remember when I was in hospital, people would say, I would have killed him. I would have been so angry. And I think you have no idea how you would feel because this has not happened to you. I just don't think there is any way you can know how you would react to something as strange as this happening. It was when I realised that he would probably most likely be dead if I hadn't broken his fall, that made me think, well, I wouldn't change it. You know, if I'm thinking of what ifs, I could easily think, what if I had died that day? That was another possibility. So it felt like a kind of scab that I stopped picking at, really, and I just let myself heal from that. And I think that's the similar way to what I feel about anger is it doesn't feel like that anger would get me anywhere.
In 2018, Grace Spence Green was involved in an event that would dramatically reshape her life. What happened grabbed headlines because it was so shocking and unexpected, but the ripples of that day were also subtle and nuanced. Welcome to Lives Less Ordinary on the BBC World Service YouTube channel. I'm Asya Fuchs. Let's meet Grace. Thank you for being here with us today, Grace.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you talk us through why October 17th is such an important day in your life? You know, what happened that day in 2018?
I was a fourth year medical student at the time. I was 22. I had just one more year of medical school left, so I was feeling like I was getting into kind of grips with it and looking forward to starting work as a doctor. On that day, we were travelling from a clinical placement we had kind of out of London. And so my friend, who was another medical student, picked me up and we drove into London because I was going to coach kids climbing, which I did weekly in North London. She dropped me off at a shopping centre in East London because she wanted to do some shopping and I could get the train from there. I remember saying goodbye to her sort of at the escalators, and I remember walking along the main atrium of the shopping centre, and then I remember waking up again, which was completely surreal to me. But I remember waking up again and seeing the bright lights of the ceiling of the shopping centre.
So sort of like waking up from already being in an awake state.
Exactly. Really, really strange to get your head around. And I remember screaming, and I remember feeling that I couldn't, the sensation that I couldn't feel my legs. And at this point, when I had woken up again, I was lying on the floor and there was already quite a group of people surrounding me, and they were explaining to me that I had been hit. And I could already from that point get a sense that there was another figure lying near me, and they were telling this figure that he had fallen. So I could already piece together that there had been some kind of collision. I would find out later that figure, that man, had actually jumped from the third floor of the shopping centre and landed on my back.
Let's talk a little bit about who you were before all this happened. You know, going all the way back. You mentioned you were a climbing instructor, but climbing was something you did from when you were very little, right? From when you were 8. You were obsessed with climbing. You were the UK under-18s girls champion when you were 12, so you were like the best in the country. What did you love about the sport?
I think for me, it made me feel really capable and strong. And so often I didn't feel strong growing up. I was premature at birth. I was always sort of just under the weight growth charts. I felt like I was put on kind of supplements at one point. I felt very small and weak and sometimes sort of not considered for things because of my size. But climbing was a sport that really made me feel capable, because I'd always loved kind of clambering over things and climbing trees, but this felt like I could suddenly channel this into becoming really strong and becoming really good at a sport.
And did you know right away that you were good at it? You were like, oh, this is my thing?
Yeah, I think so. I've never been one for team sports, to be honest, but this just felt like something I could do all the time on my own or with friends. And yeah, it felt like it was a natural fit for me.
When you got a little bit older, you lived on a houseboat on the Thames in London. What did life look like for you during that period?
It was a really exciting period for me. I think it was the first time I was living with my partner, and so that felt exciting in itself. But also, I took a year out of medical school to do a master's in public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And that just felt like I was suddenly doing something really interesting that was a bit different to medicine. I felt really cool living on a boat. I felt like I was like the coolest person of my friends, and I'd invite them on the boat, and
everyone thought you were really cool.
Exactly.
It worked, yeah.
Everyone thought I was really cool. I mean, I can talk about it now, and it sounds very romantic. It was pretty difficult on the boat. It was very damp, very cold winters. Emptying the waste tank was not something I miss. But at the time, at 22, it just felt really fun. And I felt like I was filling out the outlines of myself as a person. I was starting to figure out what I enjoyed doing, what I'd wanted to do in the future.
So now we spool forward to October 2018. You're kind of like living the dream. You're living your best life. You just finished this placement in women's health, which you'd loved, watching babies being born. You're studying this thing you're super passionate about. And then, October 17th, a day like any other, this very, very brutal and shocking event happens to you. Afterwards, after what happens at this shopping center, you're taken to the hospital. You're rushed to the hospital. What do you remember any of that?
I remember really small parts, I think, of the first day. It just feels like fragments of memories. And I think it's quite hard to know what's memories and what's what people have told me about what happened that day. I find it really hard to figure out actually what I do remember. But I have this really vivid memory of being in, when I was transferred from the shopping centre by ambulance to the emergency department. I remember this feeling, and I'm sure they'd given me a lot of morphine at this point, because I remember feeling really like drunk, really, on morphine, and I felt really exposed. And I remember feeling like I was lying on this cold, hard board. I'm sure it was just a patient bed. But at that point, my parents, my partner were already there, and friends were also rushing to see me because they'd all heard the news. And I felt completely out of control of what had happened to me, what happened inside, what was going to happen, completely out of control of my dialogue. It felt like others knew much more about my situation than I did at that point.
What do you mean out of control of your dialogue?
I think the feeling out of control of my dialogue really came from the fact that after my injury, the next day it was being reported in the media already. And I had barely understood what had happened, and already people were writing articles about it and finding photos of me from kind of old climbing competitions on Google and placing them there with the man that had jumped. And in that way, I felt completely like I didn't have a voice in any of this.
And were you aware right away that this was a news story?
No, I think my family was able to shield me a bit from it, but I did hear a little bit. Journalists were already requesting to speak to me, 3 days after my injury, and then as soon as I got my phone back, I could see,
Of course. Yeah. And this man, the guy who jumped and then landed on you, I mean, you weren't aware at the time, but at the very beginning, right, he was right next to you, right? He was in a bed next to you. How do you feel thinking back on that now?
Yeah, I think I only found out that, much later when my partner told me. To me, that it just felt really strange. I think the whole situation felt so random and surreal that each part of it each little bit of information I received just felt even stranger. It felt like I'm not really piecing together a kind of clear picture.
Yeah, there's not really like a template for this.
No.
There's not like a pattern that your mind recognizes. It was,
Exactly.
Your boyfriend, your partner knew at the time, though. How did he feel about it?
I think what I'm so grateful for about my partner and my family is that they may have felt anger or whatever emotion they were feeling, but they really let me just the space to decide how I wanted to feel. And I can't say that about a lot of other people, even a lot of healthcare workers that were caring for me. Suddenly I could feel an overwhelming sense of others' rage, and they would tell me, maybe, you know, when they were by my bedside, they would say, well, I would have wanted to kill that man. And I didn't know how to react to this sort of others' rage, which was really difficult.
And can you talk me through those very early days of being in recovery in the hospital? You know, that acute phase, those first few weeks. What was it like?
I think I as a medical student, I would like to think that hospitals always give the best care, but it was real shock. It was very humbling suddenly being on the other side of the bed. How often I felt out of control of my situation. How often I felt like I didn't have any autonomy or any dignity when kind of invasive procedures were happening to me. So often people would come into my room and not introduce themselves to me. And I was so angry. I was so outraged that this had happened, and now I felt like I wasn't being explained properly what was going on. And so that was a real shock.
Would you do anything to kind of reclaim that agency? Like, did you make attempts to kind of say, like, excuse me, like, here I am?
Yeah, I think I became quite snappy at some point. I would demand to know everyone's name and their grade, like their level of what doctor they were, or what healthcare worker they were. And I think it helped a little bit that I had some knowledge. So I talk about in the book, there was a moment where a staff member was quite patronisingly trying to explain to me why I needed a neck brace. But I could tell him why. I knew the exact fracture that I had on my neck. But I can think often I would feel good that I was able to advocate for myself in this way, but I would constantly imagine, for some reason it was an old lady lying in bed, not able to advocate for herself, not able to say maybe when she was in pain or if they'd missed something or if something was wrong. And it made me feel so acutely aware of the privilege I have.
As a medical student, you'd obviously studied the spine and spinal injuries in school and class. So you knew exactly what this spinal injury meant in theory. But in terms of your own situation, did you instantly know how severe this was?
It's funny to me that I could have, I was taught about spinal injuries, but the denial was still so present. It took me weeks to, I think, actually come to the understanding that it had happened to me. And I think what kind of fueled my denial is that I looked down and there was no blood, there was no bruising apart from this bruise on my big toe. There was nothing for me to sense that something had happened to me. I looked down, I looked the same. And so I think that it was really hard to bridge that gap for my brain. I just felt that, oh, I'm not one of them. I'm not disabled. I'm not I'm not going to be in a wheelchair. That's not me. They've got it wrong. That's what sort of went on in my head. And I remember a volunteer from a spinal injury charity came to see me quite early on and was explaining, this is the support you'll receive now, but she ended up saying, you'll do this now, and you'll do wheelchair skiing, and and to me it was just too early. It was just too much, and I think it really showed my kind of internalized ableism and bias that I had probably about disabled people come to the surface, because suddenly I'm confronted with that.
So after 2.5 weeks in the first hospital and following a spinal surgery, you were moved to a different hospital where you were meant to learn how to live with this injury. You meant to learn like this new way to live. What was life like there?
That was a real shock to the system, because when I was in acute care, I was still sort of recovering, but I was able to eat takeaways there, and I'd watch TV, watch Netflix. But suddenly, I'm in a place where I'm no longer unwell. Really, I'm now something else that I didn't quite understand, and that was disabled. But I was no longer sick with this sort of clear recovery path that you'd see as a patient in an acute hospital. Suddenly I was on a spinal rehab unit where the focus is very much on getting you out of bed, getting you up in a wheelchair, learning to live again as a wheelchair user, or a cane user, or whatever you will be. And it was just so overwhelming. It was so regimented. It was sort of 6 a.m. starts. I was given a giant folder, all information about spinal cord injuries and all of the things I would now have to think about.
And then at what point do you kind of accept that this is actually a permanent state? It's not just, okay, you're on bed rest for a while.
I think probably I was starting to understand that in the first couple of weeks at this rehab unit, because I'm suddenly around lots of other people that have just had spinal injuries and are also trying to sort of deal with this new reality. But I think what really hit me personally was where we'd go through my MRI scans of my spine, and the consultant would talk about what they felt that my sort of recovery would be in terms of mobility and other things. And I think actually seeing my spine, my MRI spine, and, I'm not someone that is very good at reading scans. As a medical student, I definitely wasn't. But even I could see that something was very wrong with this MRI scan. And I think that it felt like that was really the start of this denial breaking. And suddenly I was understanding the gravity of this situation and my injury.
And was there like a real sense of camaraderie with the other patients there? Did you guys help each other?
Yeah, it was it's such a strange place. And I think it's such a unique place, but everyone I meet that's had a spinal injury will have I feel like I already have this shared understanding of it, because it's you're kind of putting together 40 people. Majority of them were kind of over the age of 40, so it was just me and one other 20-something guy, putting us all together in this really painful place in a lot of ways, really difficult. Everyone's going through their own transitions, and some people really struggled, and it was quite hard to, while I'm dealing with my own, see other people struggling so much. But there definitely was a camaraderie that I talk about in the book, about how some of the relationships and friendships I've made there that I now think of as my closest friends, that I would never have, our paths would not have crossed unless we were in this place together. One of my great friends, Vince, I met him on the rehab unit, and he was in his late 40s at the time, and he was a scaffolder in Essex, and we just got on so well, and it's just a closeness that I haven't really experienced before, because we've gone through this thing together, and now we call most days, and he's coming to my wedding, and it's just
You
yeah.
call most days.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, he's great on the phone.
Oh.
So it's that's been so wonderful, and not something I ever would have expected to gain from this injury.
And in terms of, your recovery, if you can call it that, or like learning to live in this new way, what sorts of goals or like mini goals would you have on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis there?
So they were really passionate about 2-week goal meetings, which was really helpful for me, because I think I am quite a goal-orientated person. I like doing homework. I felt like I suddenly had things to work towards. So that might be as small as being able to transfer from the bed to a wheelchair, or learning to drive again with hand controls, or going swimming for the first time. It's all about trying to get you to a place that you're ready to be discharged and be able to function in the world.
So you talked about this sort of like goal setting that you did here, like transferring from bed to wheelchair, or swimming, or cooking. But there was a holy grail of recovery, right? And that was always walking for most of the patients. Why is that? Why was walking like the ultimate goal?
Exactly. And I think I really fell into that. I really felt like I am going to walk out of this rehab unit, triumphantly, without the wheelchair. And it's really interesting to me that I fell into this narrative very quickly. But I think it's all that I'd seen on TV shows and films. There's so many montages of someone learning to walk again, and they go on the parallel bars and then they're sort of fixed. And I think for me, the core of that really was to look less disabled. So I remember there was a patient on the rehab unit who had a higher level injury than me. So his hands were affected as well, but he was able to walk, but he had much less hand function. And I remember feeling so envious of him, which is really strange to me now, because I need my hand function to be able to do my job that I love. But for me, at that moment, the most important thing was looking less disabled to other people. And in that way, that was walking again.
How were you able to let go of that, to let go of the idea that that you had to walk again, or that you would walk again, or that was the most important thing?
I think I still was really trying, even after I was discharged. We would go to a neurophysio a place just outside of London, and I'd kind of learnt to sort of stand kind of unaided, and but it would be kind of 5 hours out of the day to drive there and do the session and come back, and we'd do that twice a week. And at this point, I had already done lots of wheelchair skills sessions as part of rehab. I was starting to feel quite comfortable in my wheelchair, and I remember thinking on the way to one of these sessions, who am I doing this for, really? Because it doesn't feel like I'm doing it for myself anymore. No matter if I can get a slight movement back or not, this injury wasn't going away. You know, all of the other things that people maybe don't see in terms of sort of continence issues, skin issues, neuropathic pain, none of that was that had just happened to me. And so I felt like I was realising that I was going along this path for others and for other people that had asked me, are you going to walk again? How's your recovery going? Because that was the most important thing.
Other than, this idea of walking, did you find that you had other, perceptions of living with a disability that were just wrong, preconceptions that you now had to confront?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to think as a medical student, before I was quite inclusive, but I really think I thought that disabled people had a less quality of life, because I just think that's what I was taught, really. And after my injury, I just thought my life suddenly was much smaller, because I didn't know any disabled people. I didn't know any ordinary disabled people living lives, having families, partners, good jobs. I felt like I had no one to look towards.
And how did that start to change for you?
Honestly, for me, it was doing things like even when I was still at the rehab unit, just following disabled people on social media was just so important to me, to just start filling my feed with lots of disabled people posting just about their regular lives, and just normalising for me. And it just made me think, okay, if they're doing that in America, I could do that, or if they're doing that in the UK. And I think for me, speaking to a doctor I found who was a wheelchair user in Scotland really made such a difference, because it made me think, okay, if someone else is doing it, I can do this as well.
Working as a doctor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then 10 months after your injury, you went back to your studies to become a doctor. Was that, how hard was that to step back into a hospital as a doctor, having spent so much time there as a patient?
It was really hard to go back to medical school. I was really excited for it because it was a part of my identity that hadn't changed since my injury. I was really holding on to that. But it was so hard for lots of different reasons, for, quite a small one. But, I was still only early 20s. But the idea of not being in my year group suddenly felt really awful, and not having kind of my friends around me in that year. And I felt like everyone was moving on ahead of me. That was hard, I think.
And you're like, how old at this point? You're like 23?
Yeah, exactly. So it feels like such a, the end of the world type thing. And I think it was difficult going back to a place that everyone was really nice, but everyone had obviously heard about what had happened. So I'm sort of going in, but I know that most people will know about this sensational story I suddenly felt like I was a story. And I felt
And then
really-
these are, as you say, not people who knew you. Like,
Exactly.
who knew just normal Grace before this has happened. This will have been the only thing that they'd heard about you.
completely,
Yeah.
completely. And I didn't know enough about my new self to be able to sort of know who I was now to kind of argue with that. And I think it was really small things. I remember going into one of my first lectures back in 4th year, and I dropped my pen, and I was sitting at the front because that's normally where there's sort of you can as a wheelchair user. And I remember dropping my pen and being just petrified that I wouldn't be able to pick it up. I didn't feel that confident with my balance, like leaning forward yet. And I remember the lecturer stopped the whole lecture to offer to pick it up for me, and I just said no, it's fine, because it felt so tricky, really trying hard not to draw attention to myself in any way, but being obviously the only visibly disabled person in the year, and oftentimes having all the attention on me. It was really tricky to balance that.
What happened with that pen?
I just
left it?
Yeah, I just left it on the ground until the end, which is it's so funny to me now, but at the time I think it really exemplifies how anxious I was, how shy I was, I think.
Do you think you're a better doctor as a result of having been a patient for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. I would hope I would still be a good doctor without my injury, but I think my time as a patient, I call it the best placement I could have had as a medical student, because I just think it taught me more about dignity and autonomy and the kind of fluidity of care than anything else.
And in terms of, like, I don't know, concrete takeaways or things that you do because of that experience, like what are some of them? Like, I'm sure you introduce yourself every time now.
Yeah, it's really basic things, really. It's introducing, it's explaining things that I think maybe I probably over-explain what's going to happen, what will happen, what's happened. But I find that I just am so aware of how little knowledge patients probably have at this point and how bewildered they may feel. I think it really helps because I have such a visible scar. It's obvious that I have been a patient in my life before. There's a real openness I find with patients, a kind of understanding I don't have to build already. So I find that patients are really much more open with me maybe than they would have been.
So our world isn't very well set up for wheelchair users. I mean, you had the experience even today. It's probably a pretty big question, but what are some of the kind of the everyday challenges in terms of access that you face?
I think it's really basic things, but it's so often the case. Lots of places don't have accessible toilets at all. And that instantly is just a big excluding factor for me. Lots of places have steps up and then no ramp, and then they'll say to me, "Oh, well, we don't get many disabled people in here." And I think, well, of course you don't. You haven't made this accessible, and that's incredibly frustrating. It's really basic things. It's curb cuts on pavements, or having to go all the way round a street to find somewhere I can actually get off onto the road. And it's sort of constant reminders that I'm not designed for this world.
And in terms of, people and misconceptions they may have about wheelchair users, like how do you deal with that?
I think that was the hardest thing to deal with after my injury, was that I was discharged from hospital, trying to start going to the supermarket, the gym, just be outside again in the world. And I felt like I hadn't changed really inside yet, but suddenly people's reaction towards me was so different, and I found that the biggest difficulty to overcome really after my injury.
I know that you've called out people who've said like stupid or hurtful things to you. Can you tell me about that? How do you deal with them?
Yeah, I think again, when I was quite newly injured, I found I was so vulnerable to these comments, and I didn't feel like I just had to accept them. I felt like it was just my thing to keep. And like I describe it as sometimes it felt like a stranger was coming into my world and just spitting on it, because it would be, I'd be getting a taxi somewhere and they'd ask me what happened to me, and I would tell them because I felt obliged to. At the time, I didn't want to make them uncomfortable. And then they would say something like, well, that's tragic, that's awful, that's the worst thing that could have happened, etc., etc. And I felt like I had to carry that. I felt like I'd given them a bit of myself, and now I had this horrible comment that I sort of had to bring with me on my day. And that was tricky. It got to the point I just couldn't cope with that anymore. I couldn't cope with answering these questions and receiving these responses that I didn't want. So I've had to become a lot more. I've had to create boundaries for myself and become.
And what do you say now?
Well, the added bonus of writing this book is I can now tell people you'll just have to buy my book to find out. And then I hope, in a way, that maybe they will buy it and they'll read it and think, oh, maybe I won't ask the next disabled person what's wrong with me. So. That's been really useful.
And I mean, you don't have to tell this story, but I was thinking in particular of the drunk guy spilling the drink.
Maybe a year or so ago, I was at a pub with some friends outside, and it often happens, these comments, when I'm feeling really good. I'm having a really good time. I have my electric attachment that I use, and I just dropped some stuff off for my parents. So it felt really nice that I was able to care for other people, now that I have all of these tools like my wheelchair and my bike. And I was with my partner and some friends, and I remember wheeling past with my bike to get the waitress's attention, and there was a really drunk guy. He just said something like vroom vroom, and it just really annoyed me, because I just felt like I just want to exist in this world without someone using me as like a joke or trying to interact with me, or it's like I'm not a toy to just be sort of pointed at and laughed at. And maybe I'd had some drinks, so I had a bit of courage. So I went back up to him and I got really close to his face and I said, do you think that was funny? Was that funny? And he just was silent. He didn't say anything. He looked so ashamed, and it made me think about these people. They say these things and they don't expect to be called out on them often. And then I told him that I thought it was really funny that he actually had spilt his drink all over himself that I had just witnessed earlier. And that was really satisfying. And often these interactions don't go as well as that in
Yeah, normally it's like, 2 hours later that you think of
I've had so many arguments in the shower where I'm just talking to the wall. I'm thinking, yeah, that's what I would have said at the time. So that felt really satisfying to me, because I think, okay, I've said everything I wanted to say to this person.
And I need to ask you about the man who jumped, because listeners will want to know, do you know what happened to him?
I know very little, and I think I've sort of kept it that way. I kind of had no interest. I think people are looking for this sort of restorative justice, sort of I meet and I forgive the man, but there was no forgiveness because there wasn't any anger to begin with. So no, I know very little, and I think, I was told that he had jumped and that he was then charged and he was later deported, and that upset me because I kind of didn't want any more ramifications of this event to have happened. I sort of wanted it to just stop, and to me it feels like we were strangers, we collided, and we are just strangers again. And I think because of the randomness of the event was such that's helped me really not feel any anger towards him.
I think he was sentenced to 4 years for grievous bodily harm. He served 2, and then he was deported. But I wonder, do you have people who struggle to kind of understand that? Do you have people who just can't comprehend that you not only let it go, but he's just like you don't even think of him, as you say.
I think people often don't understand, but I think that's what I find interesting, is that strangers, or I remember when I was in hospital, people would say, I would have killed him, I would have been so angry. And I think you have no idea how you would feel, because this has not happened to you. I just don't think there is any way you can know how you would react to something as strange as this happening. And I think for me, that sort of anger, and again, it's sort of tied in with what ifs. So I went through a lot of what ifs when I was first in hospital, because it's easy to think, what if I was 2 minutes before or 2 minutes later, and then it wouldn't have happened. And it just felt so like an endless cycle. I wasn't getting anywhere with these thoughts. And it was when I realised that he would probably most likely be dead if I hadn't broken his fall, that made me think, well, I wouldn't change it. And if I'm thinking of what ifs, I could easily think, what if I had died that day? That was another possibility. So it felt like a kind of scab that I stopped picking at, really, and I just let myself heal from that. And I think that's the similar way to what I feel about anger is it doesn't feel like that anger would get me anywhere. I'd much rather be angry at society's treatment of disabled people, the media's depiction of disabled people, when I can't get into a restaurant or whatever. I'd much rather be angry at that, because that feels like it's anger that can change things.
And I mean, now, 7 years on, almost 7 years on, do you have any idea of why he did it? That ever come out in the trial, or?
No, I didn't really follow the trial. I was told sort of little bits of information at the time. Yeah, I think the more information that came out, the more random it was. It didn't really make sense. I'd never understood why he did that, but that kind of helped in a way, because I didn't feel. I know people that have been kind of targeted in some way or attacked in some way, and that's a much different thing to navigate. And I think the randomness of the event actually helped me.
That day in October, right, it changed the course of your life, right? It changed so many things for you. But do you think it changed you as a person?
Absolutely. And I think that the day of my injury hadn't changed me. It was many months and years later that I feel like it has shaped me into the person I am now, who's much more confident, much more anchored to kind of a sense of self, because I think I've had to build myself up from the ground.
And what about, the people around you, your partner, your parents, your close friends, how has it changed those relationships, and what has this event kind of revealed to you about the people in your life?
I think it's given us a closeness with my friends and family that I may not have had without my injury. I think when you introduce an aspect of care into a relationship, it can be difficult, but it can be really powerful. And I feel like I quite early on had to have some really difficult conversations with family and friends about what I needed or what they hadn't done for me, or, if friends had invited me somewhere that wasn't accessible. I suddenly felt like I have to tell these people because they're important to me, and this is now my life. And so I think I was a lot more honest in relationships, which has actually made us a lot stronger. And I think particularly with my relationship with my partner, I think it has brought us even closer, because of the fact that he cares for me in ways that I didn't need the care before.
We've talked about how, what it's like to navigate a world that it feels like isn't made for you, where in a lot of cases, like, it doesn't feel like you belong. But there is, there's one place where you do feel completely at ease, like you belong there totally. Can you tell me, about this place and what it means to you?
Yeah, so the Kenwood Ladies Pond at Hampstead Heath is somewhere that I used to go a little bit as a teenager, but it was a bit too cold for me, and my mother loved going there. But it was so classic that after my injury, there were so many things I just assumed was just not possible for me now. But I remember my mum went up there one time and said she thought she could see that there was a lift into the pond, and I just thought that was crazy. Like, I couldn't imagine that an outdoor pond would be accessible. But I went up there, and they've got a mechanical lift, which is really important because it's not electric, so it doesn't break down ever. And they've got this fully accessible kind of changing area outside and an accessible bathroom. And that was just unbelievable to me, that I could actually, also I could cycle up there on my own with my hand bike. I could go there on my own, go swimming and come back on my own. That was just, life-changing for me. But I think what I love most about there is it's just you're suddenly kind of in the middle of London, but you're so close to nature. So I would have like these herons and birds just swimming past me, at eye level. And I think that's something as a wheelchair user that's really important, that connection with nature that we often might not get because we're not kind of touching the grass with our feet or whatever. So this is such a powerful way for me to do it. And I just think it's just a place that feels like so safe and supportive.
No, thank you so much. I'm going this weekend for a friend's birthday.
Lovely. Enjoy.
Doctor and disability activist Grace Spence Green. She's written a book about her experience. It's called To Exist as I Am. My thanks to Grace for sharing her story, and thank you for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe to the BBC World Service YouTube channel so you can never miss an episode. And we'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment below. I'm Asya Fuchs. Take care.